The confetti from the wedding still clung to the corners of his car when the first lie was planted. It grew quietly, watered by courteous smiles, suspicious timelines, and a child whose eyes mirrored no one in his family. When the truth finally arrived, it did so in sterile courier packaging, a DNA report with numbers that turned the floor into a cliff edge. He could have raged and shattered, but he chose precision instead. He studied the lie that tried to consume him, mapped it, and then pressed a button that set a different kind of fireworks into the sky, carefully timed, immaculately legal, and impossible to ignore. Marcus Williams was the kind of man who underlined instructions and saved warranty cards. He was an operations engineer who trusted systems, bridges, servers, schedules, and the daily work of showing up. He believed in redundancies, quality checks, and measurements that kept people safe. Even his love for Elena felt like a well-built structure, months of kind attention, meticulous planning, and a slow, steady investment that promised a lifelong yield. The wedding reflected that ethic. Nothing extravagant, just elegant, string lights, a small live quartet, and a vow to lift each other when gravity misbehaved. Yet even that night had unstable loads hidden within it. His future mother-in-law clasped Elena's hand in a way that looked protective but felt possessive. The photographer seemed to place Marcus at the edge of frames, not the center, and later, the album arrived with curious omissions and angles. At the venue, staff greeted him with a professionalism that strained at the edges, twice asking to confirm his role as groom as if a black man in a tux beside a white bride were an unlikely configuration. He logged those microfractures in silence, telling himself that the bridge would hold once everyone learned the load it was designed to carry. The first months of marriage were a slope of adjustments. Elena's phone, previously relaxed on countertops, began living face down. Her gym hours stretched into late evenings, and explanations turned soft and shapeless. When she told him she was pregnant, his heart vaulted ahead of his doubt, and he anchored himself to hope. He set up the crib, assembled bookshelves, and drafted a budget that made room for daycare, emergencies, and a future college fund. He measured walls for framed sonograms and ignored the quiet tick of something off. Around them, old inequities arranged themselves like furniture. A neighbor's complaint about noise was filed on a night when only the clock was loud, and it landed because the HOA had learned to hear imagined disruptions when his name appeared. Elena's relatives staged their acceptance like a pageant, performing friendliness while directing questions solely to her as though his career were a rumor. On their first holiday together, a cousin joked about his presence as a phase the family would outgrow, and the room laughed just long enough for him to notice. Marcus had spent a lifetime learning which storms required shelter and which demanded a blueprint. He kept showing up for the marriage, even as the floor creaked. He told himself that love was an engineering problem, solvable with reinforcement and patience. When the baby arrived, he practiced swaddling until the blanket folded like origami. The child was perfect and small and unprepared for the world's comparisons. Visitors cooed about resemblance in a way that felt like performance art. One aunt tilted her head as if searching a distant shore. Marcus absorbed it all, clinging to the possibility that blood isn't the only blueprint for belonging. Still, a question rose when he tried to sleep. It wasn't loud. It didn't accuse. It simply returned, night after night, and asked to be measured. Numbers had always been comfort. They didn't argue, they clarified. Marcus approached the question like a maintenance inspection on a system designed to last. He didn't snoop. He didn't fight. He simply gathered. He exported the wedding photos and examined their metadata, tracking timestamps and geotags. He sorted bank statements and noticed transactions that correlated with Elena's elongated gym sessions but were posted near a boutique hotel downtown. He cross-referenced the hotel's digital footprint with traffic patterns and found that a certain Thursday aligned with a suspicious group rate negotiated by someone with a first name that once occupied Elena's college stories. He learned a long time ago that the burden of proof is heavier for people who look like him. Racial bias had taught him the difference between being right and being believed. He assembled a file that could stand alone without narration, receipts, screenshots, calendar blocks, and images sourced through legitimate means, never crossing into illegality, never touching the privacy thresholds his attorney warned him about. He took a paternity DNA test designed to provide clarity for anxious parents. The courier arrived with bureaucratic politeness. 2 swabs, chain of custody forms, and signatures that felt like bracing a structure before a controlled demolition. While waiting for results, he carried on. He changed diapers in the blue hour before dawn and sterilized bottles with the devotion of a ritual. He journaled the child's milestones and wrote blessings along the margins, refusing to let the uncertainty steal light from a person who had done nothing wrong. He made sure his will included provisions for a future that might not include his name on a birth certificate. He did these things because love, to him, was not contingent, even when trust had become a battlefield. Around him, the weather worsened. Elena's family made comments embroidered with niceness and threaded with exclusion, suggesting parenting classes as if his hands were unqualified. A colleague warned him that whispers had begun, gossip that he was controlling, born from the old script that paints black men as threats when they dare to set boundaries. The script had always been a machine that tried to manufacture guilt out of thin air. Marcus refused to feed it material. The results arrived in a plain envelope that hummed like a transformer. He read the numbers twice and then a third time, tracing the decimals until their finality became a fact that no imagination could soften. Probability of paternity 0. The math did not leave room for debate. He felt grief, then quiet, then an odd sense of relief that the question had resolved itself. He considered rage and found it heavy and imprecise. Precision was the trade he knew. He crafted a plan. He scheduled a consult with a family attorney known for meticulous filings. Fraud in the inducement of marriage, the lawyer called it, if evidence supported the timeline. He retained a digital forensics expert to authenticate the metadata from the wedding night and the days surrounding it. He opened a separate bank account and moved his direct deposits, not as punishment but as safety. He prepared a statement that avoided accusations and stuck to verified facts. He asked for nothing theatrical. He chose a venue where the truth would echo properly, a carefully planned celebration billed as a vow renewal on the first anniversary. The anniversary event was staged like a kindness. Friends and family received invitations embossed with gold edges. The venue was neutral, the food generous, and the schedule neat enough to calm every suspicion. Marcus arrived early, the engineer on site before the test. He verified that the projection screen worked, that the envelopes were sealed and labeled, that the notary had the correct pages, that the child had a sitter who knew to leave before the finale. This was not a spectacle, it was a controlled release. The guests arrived in small currents of perfume and chatter. Elena glowed with an optimism he could not share. Her mother moved through the room like a stage manager, counting heads and smoothing details, confident that narrative control resided with the loudest host. Old inequities took their places at the edges of the room, ready to reinterpret whatever happened next as a tantrum if he raised his voice. He did not plan to. He had prepared something louder than volume. At the midpoint of the evening, the lights softened. A slideshow began with wedding photos, laughter at the altar, the first dance, a toast that caught him half blinking. The images then slowed and sharpened. Metadata appeared as captions, timestamps, locations, and camera IDs matched to sources authenticated by the expert whose sworn statement rested in the envelopes waiting on each table. The sequence crossfade to bank statements with transactions laid out as line items, personal information redacted, only dates and places remaining. No one needed a narrator. Correlations formed like constellations impossible to unsee. The final slide displayed a simple header and a number. The report summary followed with the laboratory's seal, the chain of custody documentation, and the result that reduced the room's oxygen, 0 probability of paternity, with confidence intervals that closed the door on ambiguity. Elena's smile collapsed so swiftly it seemed time had skipped. Whispers arrived in waves. Her mother looked for a trapdoor that wasn't there. The projector made a soft fan sound that carried like a verdict. Marcus stepped forward without raising his voice. He did not accuse. He presented. Printed packets arrived at each table, delivered by the event staff with the same grace as dessert menus. Inside each packet was a notarized summary, the supporting exhibits, and a letter to the guests requesting privacy for the child and an end to rumors that had painted him as controlling or unstable. The letter explained, in measured prose, that the betrayal happened on the wedding day and that the timeline made the deception structural, not incidental. It asked the recipients to consider their roles in a culture that believes the worst about black men first and last, and to reflect on how that culture had nearly trapped him in someone else's dishonesty. He concluded the presentation by announcing the steps already in motion: a petition for annulment based on fraud, withdrawal from joint accounts into a separate legal structure his attorney had arranged, and a trust established for the child's needs that did not depend on a relationship with him. There was no public shaming or name-calling. There was only proof, consequence, and a boundary drawn with a draftsman's pen. The room held stillness like a held breath. Then the breath released, and the story people told about him began to change. Around him, the city did what cities do. It moved forward, indifferent and alive. At work, a project he had advocated for, a bridge reinforcement across a neglected corridor, finally received funding after years of being deferred beyond neighborhoods like his. When a supervisor asked for an explanation of the design's redundancies, Marcus described how structures that serve everyone must be designed for those historically underserved first, not last. He did not say that the lesson had come from his marriage, but the application made itself plain. He declined interviews and social media dramatics. He refused to turn his life into content someone else could remix for outrage. Yet the story traveled quietly anyway, in group chats, over cautious coffees, through people who had once doubted him and now cited him as proof that a soft voice can carry far if it is crisp. He was not flattered by the attention. He was interested in the work of making his life boring again in the best sense of the word, predictable, safe, anchored by calendars and grocery lists and quiet Saturdays. In the end, the revenge people romanticized turned out to be something different. It was not a spectacle but a refusal to drown in someone else's version of him. It was a choice to let evidence speak where stereotypes had shouted. It was the discipline to build exits where walls had been painted as permanent. The nuclear part, if there was one, came from the way the truth split open a network of convenient fictions and left a clean horizon where reconstruction could begin. A year after the annulment, the scholarship committee convened for its first awards ceremony in a community center with scuffed floors and excellent acoustics. Students stood beside posters detailing designs that anticipated pressure and solved for failure without blaming the load. Marcus watched them explain their models with the excitement of people who believe their ideas will be allowed to stand. He realized then that his personal ruin had been transformed into a public foundation, and the math of it balanced to something like grace. What remains is a question he leaves with anyone who listens: when a lie intersects with a prejudice, which one are you more willing to confront first, the story that flatters your bias, or the proof that asks you to change? If the answer is the proof, then the work is clear. Believe what holds. Reinforce what serves. And when the truth arrives in a plain envelope, let it do the quiet, necessary work of rebuilding the bridge you live on.